A single silver coin, small enough to hide under a tongue, light enough to lose in the dust of a marketplace. And in the years Jesus of Nazareth walked through Judea, that one coin decided whether a family ate that night. This coin appears in the Gospels more than almost any other object mentioned in the New Testament. It is called a denarius. But here is the question almost nobody can answer. Not in Sunday school, not in a Bible study. What did that coin actually buy? Not in theory, in bread, in wine, in the price of a coat. You have heard the phrase, "Render unto Caesar your whole life." You have heard about 30 pieces of silver. You have heard the parable of workers paid a denarius for a day in the vineyard. And yet, ask the average churchgoer to name one real price from the world of Jesus, and the room goes quiet. That silence ends now. Start with the coin itself. A denarius was small, barely the size of a modern dime, struck from close to 4 grams of silver. On one side, the face of the emperor. In the years of Christ's ministry, that face belonged to Tiberius. Numismatist David Hendin, author of the Standard Reference, Guide to Biblical Coins, has spent decades tracing exactly which coins moved through Judean hands in this period. And the denarius sits at the centre of nearly every transaction the Gospels describe. Here is the number that matters most. According to the parable in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, verse 2, a landowner agrees to pay each worker in his vineyard 1 denarius for a full day of labour. That single line is one of the most important economic facts in the entire New Testament, because it fixes the value of the coin against something everyone in the audience understood in their bones: a day of sweat under the sun. So what does that mean in terms you can feel? Economic historian Peter Temin, in his study The Roman Market Economy, reconstructs Roman-era wages using tax receipts and market records from Roman Egypt, a province governed under the very same imperial system as Judea. His estimate lines up with the gospel text almost exactly. A denarius was the standard wage for 1 day of unskilled labour across the Roman world. Not a fortune, not poverty. The line between survival and hunger paid out every single evening. And that raises the real question this video needs to answer. If a denarius equals 1 day of work, what did a day of work actually put on the table? What did that silver coin turn into once it left a worker's palm and entered a market stall in Capernaum or Jerusalem? Here is where most explanations fail you. They convert ancient coins into modern dollars using silver weight alone, and that number lies to you. Silver prices swing wildly today. They meant something completely different in a world without paper money, without banks on every corner, without markets stretching across oceans. The only honest way to understand a denarius is the way people in Judea understood it, by what it physically bought. So here is the real table, not a guess. Reconstructed from Roman-era price lists, tax documents from Egypt, and rabbinic sources describing everyday Judean commerce, cross-referenced by historian Peter Temin and by biblical economic scholar Bruce Molina in his work The Social World of Jesus and the Gospels. 1 denarius bought roughly 12 loaves of the coarse wheat bread that fed most working families. Not the fine white bread of the wealthy, the dense, dark, everyday loaf that came out of a clay oven and filled a household for nearly a full day, sometimes 2. 1 denarius bought close to 1 litre of ordinary wine, the diluted working-class kind mixed with water, drunk by everyone from field hands to fishermen, because water alone in Judea was often unsafe. 1 denarius bought a small measure of olive oil, maybe half a litre, the oil used for cooking, for lighting a clay lamp through the night, and for anointing the skin, since soap as we know it did not exist. And a plain wool tunic, the basic garment worn by most working men in Galilee, could cost between 8 and 15 denarii, depending on the weave. That means a labourer might need to save nearly 2 full weeks of wages just to replace 1 torn shirt. Sit with that for a moment. 2 weeks of labour, for one piece of clothing. Suddenly, a verse you have heard 100 times sounds different. The moment Roman soldiers cast lots for the garment of Jesus in the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 23. That was not a rag. That single seamless tunic represented real, serious money. Worth fighting over. Worth gambling for at the foot of a cross. Now here is the irony almost nobody mentions. The Roman Empire ran on the denarius, roads, taxes, soldiers' pay, imperial trade. All of it moved in Roman silver stamped with Caesar's face. But there was one place in Judea where that very coin was considered unfit to use. The temple in Jerusalem. Why would the empire's own currency be rejected at the empire's most sacred site in that province? This is the detail that unlocks one of the strangest scenes in the entire gospel record. Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers. Archaeologist and historian Jodie Magnus, in her research on Second Temple Jerusalem, explains the reasoning plainly. Roman coins carried the image of the emperor, sometimes even inscriptions calling him divine. For a temple built on the command against graven images, that face was not just foreign, it was a violation. So every Jewish adult was required to pay an annual temple tax using a different currency entirely. A silver coin minted in the city of Tyre, prized because its silver content stayed remarkably pure and consistent, even though it carried its own pagan imagery, a contradiction scholars still debate today. That meant a pilgrim arriving in Jerusalem with denarii in his purse, the only coin he had earned all year, could not simply hand it to the priests. He had to exchange it first. And that is exactly why money changers sat in the temple courts at small tables, taking a cut on every single transaction. Not villains for existing. The system required them. But when Jesus flips their tables in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 21, he is not attacking currency exchange itself. He is attacking a marketplace that had crept into a courtyard meant only for prayer, turning worship into another line of commerce. If you're starting to see how much of the gospel story runs on hard numbers instead of vague poetry, that is exactly the point of this channel. Stay with this one, because the next price on this list changes how you read one of the most famous betrayals in human history. Now take everything you just learned about the denarius and place it beside a very different coin, the shekel. 30 silver shekels. The price paid to Judas Iscariot in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verse 15. Here is the detail almost no sermon ever explains. 30 shekels was not a random insult. It was an exact legal figure. In the Hebrew scriptures, Exodus chapter 21, verse 32, sets 30 shekels of silver as the fixed compensation owed if a slave was killed by someone else's ox. It was, quite literally, the price tag the ancient law placed on a human life considered property. When the chief priest offered that number for Jesus, according to Hendin's numismatic research on Tyrian shekels used in that transaction, they were not just paying a bribe. They were making a statement in the language of commerce itself, pricing a man like livestock. Converted into denarii, using the standard exchange documented in rabbinic sources from that era, 30 shekels equaled roughly 120 denarii. Remember what one denarius bought: a day of labour, bread for a household. So 30 pieces of silver was not enough to buy land, or a house, or freedom for life. It was enough for around 4 months of an ordinary man's wages. A modest sum, chosen with precision. Cruel not because it was large, but because it was small enough to prove exactly how little the priest believed that life was worth. This is where the parables snap into focus. Every time Jesus mentions money in his teaching, he is not reaching for a random prop. He's speaking directly into the financial reality sitting in his listeners' own pockets. The parable of the workers in the vineyard, in Matthew chapter 20, the landowner who pays every worker the same 1 denarius, whether they work 12 hours or 1, was not an abstract lesson about fairness in general. It was a direct provocation aimed at people who understood exactly what 1 denarius meant for their family's dinner that night. To hear that a man who worked 1 hour got paid the same as a man who worked all day was not a gentle metaphor to this audience. It was economically outrageous. That was the entire point. The parable of the lost coin in Luke chapter 15 describes a woman searching her house for 1 silver coin, likely a drachma close in value to a denarius, sweeping every corner, lighting a lamp in daylight hours to search dark corners of a small stone house. Historian Bruce Molina notes that 10 drachmas may have represented this woman's entire dowry, worn as coins on a headdress, meaning the lost coin was not pocket change. It may have been a visible piece of her identity and her security as a married woman. Losing it was not an inconvenience. It was closer to losing a piece of her name. And this brings us to the coin that started this entire investigation, the moment religious leaders tried to trap Jesus with a single denarius in Matthew chapter 22. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? They hand him the coin. He asks whose image is stamped on it. They answer, Caesar's. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Here is what almost no explanation adds. That coin in his hand was almost certainly the very same denarius bearing the image of Tiberius. The coin scholars believe carried an inscription identifying the emperor as a divine son. Every Jewish hand that touched that coin touched an object making a religious claim their entire faith rejected. Jesus was not simply commenting on taxation. He was holding up a small piece of silver that was, quite literally, a tiny idol passing through the marketplace every single day, and forcing his questioners to admit they already carried it in their own purses. The controversy was never really about money. It was about whose image a person is willing to carry. So the next time you read a gospel page mentioning a coin, a denarius, a shekel, a small copper coin dropped into a temple offering box, do not read past it as background detail. That coin was a full day standing in a field under the sun. It was bread for a family. It was the difference between owning 1 tunic or none. Historian David Hendin's decades of work cataloguing these coins prove something simple but easy to forget. The Gospels were not written in a world of symbols floating above daily life. They were written inside a world of exact prices, hard bargains, and silver small enough to hide under a tongue. And that raises one final question this channel has not yet answered. If a single coin could carry the image of a false god straight into the temple courts themselves, what happened to the coins the priests actually collected there? Where did that temple treasury go in the years right before Rome burned the building to the ground? That is the next investigation.